I thought I would do a video talking about what it would take to add a state to the United States of America, the 51st state as of right now. Now, what would that look like? Well, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be talking about Puerto Rico for the most part, and to a lesser extent, Washington, D.C. But what I'm talking about can be applied to any of the U.S. territories, including the Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, or Guam. But before we get into what it would take for a territory to become a state, I wanted to talk a little bit about what it would take, because it's been brought up several times, if they wanted to make two states out of one state or take land from two states and make a new state. Either option is as possible. Look at West Virginia and Virginia. They used to be one state. How would that work? Well, they would need to hold some kind of a referendum for the affected land area of either one or both states, depending on what they're doing. I know at one time they were talking about taking part of Oregon and Northern California and turning that into a state. What they would have to do is hold some kind of a referendum to see if the peoples of that area that would be directly affected would even want to do this. If they would, then Congress would have to approve it with simple majorities in both houses. And then once they approved it, the states themselves would both have to approve it and agree to let their land territory be divided, essentially. And then they would form a new, they would temporarily form a new state until there was a ratification of a state constitution and Congress approved the constitution, and then they would become their own state, and that's how that would work. And there'd be reappropriations of legislatures. The new state would get 2 senators and proportional representation in the House of Representatives. And they would figure all of that out based on how much land area and population was taken, etc. Okay, so that's what it would happen if part of one state or 2 states wanted to become their own state, independent from their parent state. But what would happen if Puerto Rico wanted to become a state? What would that look like? Well, first thing they would have to do is hold a statewide referendum where they get majority support on becoming a state. Then they would have to submit to the U.S. Congress that they want basically an application for statehood, saying we want to be a state, let's start this process. Congress, with a simple majority in both houses, would accept it or could accept it. When they do, then it would go back to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico would have to write and adopt a state constitution. And every state in the Union does have a constitution similar to the U.S. Constitution. They would have to outline everything that is important to them in that constitution, how their state government would function, etc. And then once they have written it, they would have to hold a referendum to ratify that state constitution and accept it as the law of the new state. Once they have ratified that state constitution, it would be then sent back to the United States Congress, where they would have to accept it. And again, it would take a simple majority in both houses. Now, we do have the filibuster to deal with in the Senate, which would require 60 votes to get around the filibuster, unless the majority party decided to either get rid of the filibuster or exempt statehood from a filibuster question, and then it would just simply be a majority vote. So 50 votes with the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote, potentially in the affirmative, or 51 votes otherwise. Now, but what would it look like if Puerto Rico became a state? Well, we'd have to come up, once they did all of that, then they would get all of the rights of any equal state. Their population would get figured up for representation in the House. They would reappropriate House districts based on population. They would remath out all the districts, and last I had heard, I think it was 6 or 7 representatives would be allotted to Puerto Rico. Now, and then they would look at where they could pull some of that representation from. Um, and I think it starts actually with California would lose a seat, but I'm not sure on that. But they would reappropriate out uh, some seats to uh, Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico would also automatically get 2 U.S. senators, bringing the total now in the Senate up to 102. So that's what would happen there. They would have to hold um, elections for those positions. Now, as you know, the Senate is up for re-election every 6 years. There's a 6-year term, and when they would figure out um, which group the Puerto Rico senators would belong in, one would belong in one group, one would belong in a second group. As it sits right now, and I don't know what the lettering is, but there's three groups, A, B, and C. One of those three groups has 34 members. The other two have 33. So they would just appropriate one senator into each group, and that would determine the election cycle for those two senators. So um, if they were elected to the group that would be up for re-election in 2026, that senator would have their initial term of being less than 2 years, and they would be up for re-election again. They would only get the remainder of the term for which their group is eligible, and then they would have to be re-elected. And that would work the same for the other senator from Puerto Rico. And then with there being elections every 2 years for the House of Representatives, all of the representatives for Puerto Rico would become eligible for re-election basically in 2026. So that's how that would work, and then they would have also the rest of the rights of any other state. Their representatives in Congress would actually not just be there to observe and be able to bring concerns up to other members of Congress and have them be brought up for them, but they would have direct representation. They could introduce bills that would help Puerto Rico as they wanted. So that's how Puerto Rico would look. But what about Washington, D.C.? Well, basically, Washington, D.C. would be the same thing. Now, a lot of people are saying they want to give statehood to Washington, D.C. Now, I did a video a little while ago talking about a wish list of amendments I would add. And what I would have added would be an idea to give the rights of statehood to Washington, D.C. while still letting it keep its district status, and you'd be letting it still function more like a city, where they wouldn't need to have a state legislature, they wouldn't need to have a governor or anything like that. Everything could still be handled at the city council level, and it's possible that they could do that with a state constitution as well. But I think that would just be simpler, is to grant a one-time special exception to calling DC a special district with statehood equivalent rights, the two senators, and equal representation in the House of Representatives. Now, should DC become a state, they would, like I said, they would get two senators. They would get equal representation in the House of Representatives. Right now, they do not have either. They have a member in the House. I believe they have somebody in the Senate, but they do not get an active vote. They can't introduce legislation or anything like that. And as far as how their senators and stuff would work, it would work the same as Puerto Rico, where they would fill into the next sets for the Senate, and they would go in wherever for the remainder of the term until their 6-year term would be up for re-election normally, and then they would be re-elected after that, or contested, or however that would play out. And what would happen if both Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. were to become states at the same time? Well, whichever one completed the process first would become the 51st state, and the one who completed second would become the 52nd state. But the process would still play out the same. Puerto Rico would get two senators. Washington, D.C. would get two senators. They would fill up the remaining of the two missing spots in the Senate pool, bringing all the Senate seats up to 34, and then they would just start over with A and B getting 35 members each. Again, they would be up for re-election based on when that cycle would go, and they would get equal representation in the House of Representatives based on their population, and they would get reappropriated out of existing states. There are some seats that would be gone, and some people who would be out of the House of Representatives as soon as that happened. The other thing that would happen is it would change the Electoral College math. Unless the House and the Senate passed something to extend and add a number of seats into the House of Representatives, and the Senate proportional to keep it the same, they would still have to stay under that 535 number. So the path, again, would change as far as the Electoral College, because you get your representation based off of 2 senators plus your members of the House of Representatives. So if they were to take a representative from the state of Iowa, which is where I live, we would go down from 6 electoral votes to 5. We would lose a House seat, and that's what we would look like going forward. Like I said, I think Puerto Rico would be eligible for, I think it's 6 members of the House of Representatives, maybe 7. So they would have 8 or 9 electoral college votes. That would be up for grabs every presidential election cycle, and I don't know how many Washington, D.C. would have. But that's just kind of an idea of how the statehood process would look like if they decided to add a 51st state. Now, we have not added a state to the Union since 1959 with Hawaii, but every election cycle this comes up as another thing people are talking about, and I'm thinking at some point this is going to happen. And like I said at the beginning of the video, just because I talked about Puerto Rico, everything I said could also apply to the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, or Guam. So, yeah, that's just an overview of what it would take to become a state.